All right, everybody, we're live. Welcome to the first Kubernetes office hours of 2018. My name is George Castro, and I'm going to be your host. First, I'm going to explain to you how this works, and then we're going to introduce our panel of experts who have volunteered their time today. Thank you for coming. And then we're going to start accepting questions from the audience. So what is this? This is basically a live stream that we do the third Wednesday of every month. We go and gather all these other experts that show up, and they give up a little bit of the time, and we basically answer all sorts of user questions. So you hop into hash office-hours on Slack, and if you've had a question that you've had a hard time getting answered in the Kubernetes user channel and stuff, we bring in experts to help you. Now, how it works is, first of all, first rule is a no judgment zone. So people had to start somewhere. So if you feel that someone's asking you questions that are a little bit too beginner, please be kind to them. On the other hand, our panel can't necessarily SSH to your machines and fix all sorts of local problems. So what we will try to do is, if we can't answer a specific question, maybe at least get you started on how to debug and things like that. And the one thing we do ask of our panelists is, if you do answer a question, maybe kind of try to talk about best practices or experiences that you might have in that area, because it's easier for us in this high bandwidth environment to kind of share our best practice stories and expertise and things like that. So with that, I'm going to start to look at the channel to see if we have questions going. And then why don't we do some quick introductions? Ilya, why don't you go first? I think you're muted. You are definitely muted.
Works as saying,
one second.
saying I have a team and various different ways, and done some work on kubeadm in the early days of it, and now coming back to cluster lifecycle and kubeadm work. In addition to that, I know plenty about networking and various other topics.
Mm-hmm. So I totally missed the first 10 seconds of your intro.
Oh yeah, so my teapot.
Yes, and your name also.
Yeah, I'm Ilya from vWorks.
Okay, awesome. As you're all listening in, because this is a remote session, please feel free to report stream issues, audio issues. I have an extra monitor here that tells me that the stream is healthy. But if you need us to adjust any of our volume levels, please do let us know. Hannes, why don't you go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Hannes from Pivotal. Colleague of mine and I are pretty new to Kubernetes as contributors. We try to make ourselves useful with a little project we got handed over from the folks at 6CLI. And basically, I'm here today just to listen in and see what's going on.
Awesome. Great. Thanks. Great to have you. Is that the Pivotal office behind you? Are they like in the middle of working on?
Yeah,
like
that's
right
the London office of Pivotal.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. We'll try to wave to them as they walk by. Frank, why don't you go next?
Yeah, so I'm Frank Greco. I'm a cloud native engineer at Northwestern Mutual here in the States. I do a lot of work with custom resource implementation and custom controllers for Kubernetes, as well as cluster bootstrap, cluster support, all the above. So.
Oh, awesome. Well,
yeah.
Thank you for joining us. We certainly appreciate you taking the time. All right, so we have questions. Actually, this question I've been waiting on since yesterday. So our first user, ZalgoHC, asks, has anyone experienced many pods stuck in a terminating state? Many pods flagged as need to kill pod. Any leads to what might be the cause? And also, how can I determine why a pod is flagged like this? Does anyone want to start with this one?
Take that. So the first thing to check would be whether you have set termination grace period and whether your app handles SIGINT, that is the Unix signal. So the SIGINT is basically what the signal that that is sent from the US to the process. If you keep Control C in your terminal, so you want to make sure that the process that is running in the pod handles it appropriately. There are some docs on that topic. I'll look them up and paste in the Slack.
Yeah. So is this, are the SIGINTs logged in a certain place, or like on disk, or is he going into the pod? He or she going into the pod itself? And
so I think Kubernetes, when it when a pod dies, it'll issue the SIG term, and then Kubernetes will basically give the pod a set amount of time to do its cleanup before it'll force kill the pod. I'd say when he's developing locally, careful, because at least on a Mac machine, when I Control C, it'll issue a SIG int, whereas Kubernetes will issue a SIG term.
Oh, that's right. Yes, I forgot that. Sorry. Yeah, Frank. Thanks for that. Yeah, because yeah. So what I said was wrong because I said SIG int. It was SIG term. All right. So if Control C works with you, that's cool. But like you need to make sure that SIG term also works. Right. There's also the termination grace period. So Kubernetes waits for the given termination grace period before it force kills the process, where it's like -9 or whatever, right?
And Zago, please feel free to, as we do answers, to post follow-up questions, and we'll get to them as we see them. Unfortunately, there is about a 30-second delay, it feels like, between when we answer the question and when you hear it on the live stream. He goes on to ask, so where's the grace period configured? I presume it's a reasonable time, like 60 seconds or so? I believe this is the doc that you're digging up now, Ilya.
I believe by default it's 30 seconds, but I could be wrong. One thing to keep in mind is if you have like an HTTP server and you have a lot of long-running requests, you want to give the grace period enough time to finish any inbound or in-flight HTTP requests. So if you have an HTTP server with a timeout set to maybe 2 minutes, you might want your grace period to also be 2 minutes to reflect any inbound requests. I don't know if it's at the pod level or the container level. I forget. Most likely at the pod level, I would guess. But.
Yeah, he's talking about the terminating being stuck for days. It's certainly not working normally, so something is going wrong.
So yeah, do check your. Well, you want to just double check to be sure that your termination grace period isn't set to something too long. I mean, are these your apps, or are these app? This is like something like Helm chart you've deployed or something else?
Yep, and you definitely put the graceful shutdown of Kubernetes documentation in the wrong channel. Ilya, you want to put that in #office_hours, not Kubernetes users.
Oh, thank you so much, George.
Yep.
The other thing I'll say, I think I've run into this issue before where pods have been stuck in a terminating state for a while. I fixed it in the past by draining the nodes. And there's I forget if it's a Docker or a kubectl command, but you can try draining the nodes, check the kubelet logs to see if the kubelet's having an issue, talking to Docker. Maybe the kubelet isn't able to get updated results because maybe of a connection issue between it and Docker. So I'd say check the kubelet logs. If that doesn't work, try draining the nodes and see if your problem persists.
Like I'm wondering if it was one node that was stuck, right, you would drain it. But if it's replicating across every node,
well, so that would be something to check.
Right.
If all the pods that are terminating are located or are just local to one node, or if it does span multiple nodes.
Right. Okay, so Zago, stick around and just keep asking questions, and we also have time for other questions at all. So if you're listening to the stream and you're in office-hours, please feel free to keep asking questions. It looks like people are finally starting work here in the U.S., and we're starting to have users join. So Let's see. He's in the middle of typing some stuff, so let's give him some time. And any other tips while we're in this topic area about grace periods as far as killing things goes?
Well, I personally find that the default grace period is often too long. So if you want to speed up your deployments for like a Go app or a Node.js app, it is fair to set it to like less than 10 seconds potentially.
Also, while we're on the topic of pod termination, Kubernetes does allow you to have pod lifecycle hooks, and you are able to do cleanup commands if you need, as Kubernetes is shutting down the pod. So depending on your application type, may or may not be useful.
Right. So if it's a custom app and let's say it doesn't like being killed that way, right? Maybe it's like an older app or something. You can at least clean up after yourself, maybe. All right. So one of the things we like to do here is gather feedback from users and stuff, write it down, and then head it back to the user. So I think I'm just going to put down reasonable grace period time. Ilya thinks it's too long. Just as an example, in the West Coast office hours last month, we had some people from SIG Cluster Lifecycle, and we were able to get some really good kubeadmin feedback as far as the scary warnings that kubeadmin isn't ready for production. So we're pretty close of removing a lot of that language once multi-master hits, and then giving people a set of confidence. But the more feedback we get from users, the better. Let's see.
Sorry, I didn't catch that, Joe. Is that to do with kubeadm multi-master, or what?
Yeah, so a lot of people, well, some people in the last office hours were like, I can't use kubeadmin because it says it's not production ready. And then we said, did you need HA? Right. He was like, not really. But I can't use it at work because it says it's not production ready, right? Because he has a policy at work unless something is called production ready. So it kicks off the discussion upstream. Hey, should the wording be that strong, right? Should we say ready production unless you need these? And it just kind of gives us a little bit of feedback of what obstacles people have with using the stuff like at work or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. And I think from what I know, we're supposed to hit GA when it comes to 1.11 release.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. Okay, so we got more information here from the problem here, which he's pasted in, and he's found a similar bug. I don't know if one of you guys wants to scan through that bug real quick. But we have some other follow-up questions, so let's go. So what does the containerized flag for kubelet do? You need to define it in the service configuration if it runs as a container?
It is intended for use with containerized kubelet. However, I do believe that this flag had been deprecated a while ago, or was supposed to be, and it's an odd one. I wouldn't recommend using containerized flags. So, for example, kubelet in Docker for Mac runs in a containerd container, not in a Docker container. However, that shouldn't really matter. And it doesn't use containerized flag. So it is only needed in certain scenarios, and I think those are quite specialized. So if you install it yourself and you happen to copy this flag from somewhere, try to remove that flag. But I do not feel like this could be related to your issue with pod stack in terminating state.
Okay, it looks like we have people furiously typing in the channel. Let's see. And if you haven't asked any question yet, please feel free to just ask your question in the channel, and as you post them, I will get to them. And while we wait for Zago to respond to that, Hugo Varela asks, hi all, can you please recommend tools for modifying Kubernetes source code and debugging those changes? Vim, ? How do you debug? Okay, so I don't want to turn this into your favorite text editor thing, but let's turn it into your favorite text editor thing. Just give people a quick rundown. What tools do you see maybe people using at work? What tools do you prefer?
So by debugging, so if he's talking about like, step through debugging potentially, for Go, there's Gogland, which is an IntelliJ IDE. There's Go Plus for Atom. Visual Studio Code has its own plugin for Go that uses Delve behind the scenes for debugging. There is actually and I'll find a link and post it, but there's an official Go blog on all of the different Go IDEs, or at least the popular ones, and it compares them with functionality, and debugging is on that list. So I'll shoot that over if I can find it.
I just wanted to add to this. You can use a debugger quite easily when you develop certain types of things. However, if you're trying to debug an issue that spawns different areas of Kubernetes, it may be really little too hard to use a debugger, and using logs is probably the by far the most common way, from as far as I know at least, right? So because Kubernetes is a distributed system, and you cannot step through things in different processes that easily. Meaning, and it will take a fair amount of setup to enable debugging. I mean, you can attach Delve to a PID, obviously. You could try that, but I haven't actually heard from anybody who's successfully used Delve or GDB or something like that with like Kubernetes essentially, right? But like if you're working on a controller or something like that, that can be quite easy. Or if you're working on like or certain parts of Kubernetes, but like that interact only with the API and don't have any particular state. But it's kind of hard to try and debug kubelet when it interacts with Docker and other things using a step-through debugger.
I think for me, for a lot of my people, it feels like I've seen every OS and every editor, like everywhere. Although I feel that we strongly at Heptio leans towards Visual Studio Code. So I don't know. It's one of those programming questions we'll answer forever. One of the things we do is when we have the Western Coast edition, sometimes I repeat questions like this when I have different guests, so that we can get different viewpoints and opinions. So do feel free to check the YouTube channel tomorrow or so when we post the later office hours in about 6 hours from now, if you're interested in more opinions from that. And it looks like the crowd is posting in useful links in the channel, so thank you very much. We certainly appreciate when the community starts to help us all Google to try to help someone's problem here. Ranga PV asks, "Hi Kubernauts, my question is, in a federated cluster, QFed init is not very explicit in the documentation. Some clarity like authorization modes would be helpful. Do we have RBAC enabled? The documentation does not talk about it, whereas the login pops up after install." So this doesn't feel like a question, or do we want to talk about federation here for a second?
I mean, it seems like yeah, you're right, but I think that there's like a specific question whether RBAC would be enabled, right? Mm-hmm. And how do you tell that, perhaps? I mean, from what I know about kubefed, it's a tool for joining a few clusters into federation. So whatever you use to configure the underlying clusters will answer that question. So if, for example, you set up 2 clusters with kubeadm and 2 different instances, and then you create federation using kubefed on top of that, you would have RBAC enabled unless you disable it explicitly. Mm-hmm. For example, right?
There is, so I haven't actually used federation, but I've browsed the documentation for it. And it seems like the Kubernetes community is split between federation and going to something else. I forgot what they were going to call it, but at KubeCon they were calling it something else. And it almost seems like, I believe, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, but there's an actual separate, like, dedicated API group specific to federation. So like deployments aren't like app/deployments, it's federation.something/deployments. And I don't think RBAC is one of them, and like custom resources isn't another one. there's not resource parity between resources you can use on like a standalone cluster versus you can use on a federated cluster. Now people have like written their own custom controllers to make sure that if you apply something, it is replicated across all of your clusters. If it's not one of those resources that falls under that Federation API. But I will look up and post a link to that Federation API group.
Yeah, because we did this. Even the SIG got renamed, right? It's SIG multi-cluster now, right?
That's right. Yeah, and I mean, I wanted to add one thing. It's like, you know, if you are thinking to use Federation, think carefully whether that's really what you want. If what you actually want is to make sure that you have the same things running in a set of different clusters, you could easily leverage what we call GitHubs to enable that. So you essentially check in configuration into a repo, and then you have a reconciliation operator deployed in each of those clusters connected to that repo. We have built one of those reconciliation operators. It's called vFlux. You're welcome to take a look at that. But yeah, essentially it's about, so if it's about synchronizing deployments running in multiple clusters, you don't really have to look at Federation API. If it is about networking, if you wanted to have applications in different clusters talking to each other, I do not think Federation API provides you that. And for that, you can take a look at VNet, which is pretty good at bridging multiple clusters and keeping the connection going independently of what infrastructure you run it on.
Mm. And he goes on to say he's raised the issue that the binary is missing and it's still open for 1.9. If you can give me the link to the issue, we'll go ahead and add it to the notes and then see if we can follow through.
Is Federation under active development, or is that stopped?
So there were so many SIG meetings at KubeCon. That was one of the ones I did not attend, so I can't answer that. Other than okay. I know everything got renamed, and if you say Federation, someone corrects you about something. But let's see, we have an issue now. I'll go ahead and put it in the notes. Maybe we can help point to them that this is like a real issue that's blocking someone. And then we'll move from there. So for those of you that are joining, usually if we can't find an answer to your question, we will do our best to either take that feedback back to SIGs or give you a place where you can move forward with that. So it looks like people are still exchanging notes about this, and then he goes on to ask about WeaveNet for Federation. Ilya, why don't you give us a few minute summary on what you guys are working on here?
So yeah, sure. I mean, WeaveNet supported the multi-data center use cases from the very beginning. To do that, we have a eventually consistent control plane, unlike other networks which depend on SCD. We have our own state, which we maintain by gossip and CRDT. I can tell you more about that if you're very much interested. But essentially, what that gives us is a resilient control plane where it works well in a split brain scenario. And we also have encryption with IPsec built into WeaveNet, and that all comes with very, very easy user experience. So setting up a WeaveNet network that spawns multiple clusters is very, very easy. You don't really have to depend on pretty much anything. There are very simple things that you'd have to take care of, such as make sure that certain ports are open. But for the rest, it does everything for you. You don't have to set up a VPN bridge, any of those things like Direct Connect and Amazon Cloud or anything like that. It's all taken care of for you through WeaveNet. So yeah, and the only other piece that you'd have to do still that we don't quite cater for is enable service discovery between different clusters, and that's something you can actually achieve with core DNS. Core DNS can be configured in a way that you would have a DNS zone for each of the clusters. So you can talk to what is it, db.default, blah, 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 dot zone A, and the other one would be in zone B or whatever. So if you want to hear more about it, I'm happy to chat in the channel or direct message or whatever.
Yeah. Do y'all have a channel on the Kubernetes Slack?
We don't have a dedicated channel on Kubernetes Slack. We do have a Slack of our own.
Oh, okay. All right. All right.
Press the link.
Yep, that'd be great. Vlad asks, since we're talking about debugging, any other recommended tools for application debugging? Any links to Solo, IO, Squash, and Telepresence? I've not used Squash, but I've seen demos of Telepresence, and it looks pretty dope. What do you guys think?
I've actually looked at some of the implementation details. I think it's pretty decent for certain use cases, but you need to be careful when you're using it. It probably wouldn't work very well within legacy applications. It does stuff like override LD preloads. Essentially, it injects a number of things to your binary that are different from what you would usually get on Linux. And I'm not entirely sure whether it works on Mac OS or Windows or anything like that.
Are you talking about Telepresence or Squash?
Yeah, that's about Telepresence. Telepresence is essentially a way to make any process running on some machine somewhere to feel like as if it was running on a Kubernetes cluster.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I can do is we're always looking for demos for the community meeting. So I will definitely write down that these two would be really good. I'd not heard of Squash before, so I'd like to.
Yeah, I've not heard of Squash either. I'm going to take a quick look. Yeah.
The other thing I'd say about debugging, and this goes back to when you're building your container, like say if it's a Go binary, it's very easy to tempted to like do it from scratch and copy your binary in and call it a day. But then like if you want to test out a network error, you don't have curl, you don't have NS lookup, you don't have any of these things. So like I've started using from like a minimal Alpine base, where I at least have a package manager to have the ability to install utils if I need to. So just simple debugging like that. When you're building your containers, allow yourself to have those debugging tools if you need them.
Mm-hmm. Vlad goes on to say, first of all, Telepresence does work on Mac and Windows too with some limitations according to the documentation. I'm trying to avoid VSDebug. He's doing .NET Core in the container and replicas :1. So thanks for that. I think there's definitely more follow-up on tools like this. So I will take an item to chase down those projects and see if they're willing to do like demos for us at a community meeting and maybe kick off the conversation. All right, keep posting follow-ups though. Thanks Vlad for showing up. You can always help us all by tweeting that these sessions do start. This is a relatively new program. I think we started in October, so we are really glad that you're here, and if you can help us get more users and more interest, and we can help the program grow. And of course, you're welcome to stay in the Office Hours channel. I know some people like to use it because it's definitely way less noisy than Kubernetes users, so feel free to use those resources. Also, if I missed one of your questions, please let me know in the Slack channel. Next, Ranga PV asks, the recent release of Concourse for CD and Kubernetes, will it replace Draft plus Brigade? I don't know if we have any experience with CD tools.
I could take that.
Sure.
Will it replace Draft plus Brigade? I haven't seen the release notes for Concourse, but I will definitely take a look. However, I do think that CI is the kind of space where there's always going to be plenty of diversity, right? Mm-hmm. There are different features in different systems. So Brigade plus Draft is more of a DIY style approach, while Concourse probably provides you a well-packaged system. But the well-packaged system might come with pieces you might not like, so you might like to choose something different. And there's always a big question of whether you want a hosted CI system or one that you run yourself, and those differ significantly usually.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of people's CI/CD decisions is totally based on their culture and very business specific.
Yeah, that's right.
And
like,
it feels like one of those areas that there never will be consensus in, sort of like the text editor.
Right. And one thing I wanted to add to this is that if you actually take the GitOps approach, you no longer have to care about whether your CI has any integration with Kubernetes whatsoever. Your CI is there to run builds, and the GitOps approach would be implemented via a Git reconciliation operator that makes sure that certain configuration is applied to the cluster.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Peter Sauer asks a question I've always wondered. What are the best practices for staging? We're about to use Kubernetes in our company. Currently, we have a production stage, a mirror to prod stage, and a QA stage. Do you recommend separate clusters for this, or do you recommend using separate namespaces?
One of my favorite questions.
Yeah, like
I can leave it to Frank. Do you want to take that? Do you have an opinion on this?
I find I'm very confused on, like, people tell you about namespaces, and then you hear people, and then they tell you they have like 5 separate clusters, and I'm like, why is that? I guess.
So I guess I can tell you how we do it
Okay.
here at Northwestern Mutuals. So we'll have 3 different environments. We'll have an integration environment, a QA environment, and a prod environment. QA environment is kind of like the prod mirror, or at least we strive to make it that. Each one is a separate cluster, and if at least 2 of those were in the same cluster but separate namespaces, I feel like I would drive myself crazy, because it as a developer, and when I'm implementing the cluster and supporting the cluster, I don't want to chance making some CNI change and then having 2 environments go down. And lots of times when you do stuff, there's a lot of resources that aren't namespace based, and that are cluster specific. And if you want to develop in one, I don't know. I think it's best to have 2 separate clusters, because it's truly separation of responsibilities. You can mess up one cluster and not worry about messing up another cluster. And in this case, it translates into the environment. And I've just been in one too many meetings where I'm explaining to the business why developers can't develop in a cluster or can't do their work because a cluster is down.
Do you find, since I have you here, do you find that there are operational challenges keeping? Because with separate clusters, I feel like the chance for drift in between the 2 clusters starts to.
So this depends on how you do your automation and CI/CD. So everything we do is automated, and so like every time you deploy to a cluster, like it's not a human deploying to a cluster; it's some automated job that's deploying it. We don't like actively reconcile, like our QA environment and prod environment, because stuff's going to go to QA before it goes to prod. But when a developer will make a change to some code, they'll push it to the CI tool, and then Ansible will take over and deploy it into the different clusters. And so from that standpoint, it doesn't necessarily drift. Now there's the other side. Like if you don't come from the application side and you're more on like the infrastructure side, if you're making changes to, like, let's say a Kubernetes version, then to minimize drift, we make sure that if we make a change to the environment, we're not like waiting a month and then making the change to the other environment, and then waiting a month and making a change to the other environment. We'll make a change to the environment, do our checkout, and then move on to the next environment. So yeah, but have any of you guys done like different environments and different namespaces but similar clusters? And if so, like I'd be interested to see how you guys minimize the blast radius.
Yeah, because I feel like when there's a point release, the time it takes that point release to basically drift down from your testing stuff all the way to the prod one, right?
Yeah. So very soon we're going to go to 1.9. Hopefully 1.9.2. I think 1.9.1 is out right now. and we'll do it in our lowest environment. We're coming from 1.7, and so there's some additional changes that, because 1.9 is a bigger upgrade. But we'll keep it in our integration environment for, I don't know, maybe like a week, because this is a bigger change. And then we'll move to QA, maybe leave it there for a few days, then go to prod. And everything to do is automated, so it's just like a change in an Ansible playbook, and then just redeploy, retag, and or commit tag, and then update the job.
Mm-hmm. Vlad wants to add that he uses namespaces for app separation if it makes sense. Namespaces fit better for different areas / groups of apps. Clusters for environment separation. A different namespace won't save you if you want to test something more involved, like an ingress / CNI, which is what you were talking about before, Frank. Ilya, how do you guys do it at Weaveworks?
Yeah, we totally run separate clusters. We run a dev cluster, which is kind of like staging / QA or whatnot, where we deploy everything automatically, and we have another pod cluster to which we deploy in batches. So some person on call goes there twice a day and runs a batch deploy, and we manage all that with GitOps and our reconciliation operator, essentially. Well, we sometimes may run different version of Kubernetes in dev for a little while before we put it out to prod, and do various things like that. We are also able to spin up clusters pretty quickly and recover from just about anything pretty quickly. However, we find that this approach is much better because we run our own clusters and such things. I can only think of like a few cases where, let's say, you're not managing your own cluster. You have let's say you have a GKE deployment and you use node pools and such things. For example, node pool could allow you to roll out different versions of nodes in like as in Kubernetes, separately. But like it gets quite involved if you want to run multiple environments in one cluster, and it definitely seems like the kind of thing you can do only if you're not running Kubernetes yourself. If you get a GKE cluster, but in that case, you might still need ways to spin up new clusters and deploy everything on them. It's just it's just a little too involved to run things in namespaces. You really have to do all the work yourself to enable namespace isolation. Namespace is the kind of abstraction that allows you to hang isolation on, but it doesn't actually give you isolation out of the box.
Okay. And Hugo Varela adds, good question. We are currently using in a bank separate clusters for stages, one for integration, one for QA, and one for production. So it seems to be overwhelmingly separate clusters from this group this morning so far. Also, Ilya, you mentioned GitOps a lot, which I've known you for a while, so I know exactly what you're talking about. If you could paste a link to your GitOps series of blog posts, definitely well worth a read for all of those of you that really enjoy infrastructure as code.
Yeah, definitely do that.
Okay, moving on. This very much feels like a Frank question. Suresh asks, hi guys, what's the difference between Kubernetes operator and Kubernetes controller from a perspective of design, purpose, and functionality?
So the controller, I'm assuming you're talking about the controller manager. What do you mean by the operator?
So I could take that, Frank. So to clarify, it's kind of like almost like the same thing. So like a CRD controller or CRD operator means very much the same, for example, right? So like let's say let's consider like an off-the-shelf thing. For example, a etcd operator project it is called etcd operator, so it's like an operator, but operator is just like a slightly different term which means very much the same thing as a controller. But like I mean there's certainly a pattern emerging that a controller could be a little more involved than an operator, but I really don't see a big difference between the two terms. Operator as a term had been becoming more popular recently. And then controller, like an ingress controller, is called a controller. So ingress controller perhaps has less side effects on the API end. So I mean, perhaps one way to put it is that operator is something that can do things like create pods or roll out new versions of something or something else, while a controller just looks for certain type of Kubernetes resource and make sure that whatever needs to be done to implement that is done. However, it doesn't actually imply that any resources would be created. I think that may be one way to differentiate the two terms, but I don't think there is a broad consensus over what they mean.
If you are starting out implementing a controller, I've definitely matured and gone through many different stages of my controller implementations. Definitely look at the repos that Kubernetes provides for automatic code generation. I know Jordan Ligon and others have done some cool work to basically just run some scripts and spin up boilerplate, and more than boilerplate, but actual code for like client APIs and like generating all your deep copy functions and whatnot. But it does give you that controller boilerplate as well.
And it looks like he was typing, so let's see. He has a follow-up. In the meantime, Vlad dropped a link in chat that I think everyone should read about. It's a postmortem to Monzo's outage in December, which I remember reading when it came out, and there's a lot of great, useful information there overall. And Ilya's putting a link to some of his GitOps posts in there as well, so make sure you check those out. Bantu Geek asks a question that I feel like we get every week. Hi, everyone. What are best practices to handle cluster operations for an on-premise environment, VM or bare metal? And I suspect I know what Ilya's answer is going to be. So, Frank, how do you guys do it, of what you can tell us?
So we do. Okay, so we run a lot of stuff out in AWS, but we also do have stuff on premise that we'll run. And we use virtualization for that. There are people that talk about running it on bare metal. I've never run a cluster on bare metal. I'm not aware of anybody in our organization that has run a cluster on bare metal. I mean, maybe if we were doing like machine learning and needed like GPU acceleration or whatnot, we would, but hopefully you guys can hear me. Some of you are frozen on my screen, but
yeah, Frank, but well, some people just have computers of their own, like stack up in a rack, and they might like to run Kubernetes there just because they have those machines. But like the question is more specifically about. Let me find it. One sec. Best practices. No.
Yeah, cluster ops for an on-prem deployment, VM or bare metal. Let me just repaste this question here. I hope my keyboard isn't too loud on the stream.
So, I mean, if we're not talking about provisioning, oh, VM versus bare metal. Okay, cool. Okay, so if you're, with VMs, things become much easier. So unless you can't afford the performance penalty, then so if you can afford the tiny little performance penalty that you get from your hypervisor, better go with a VM. And it's much easier to automate and do such things, right? So even if you run one VM per machine, for example, it is still much easier to do that. And you might like. Yeah, I mean, just like all the APIs that hypervisors provide are very, very convenient.
Right, and it feels like a lot of, especially the larger organizations, went through the VM thing years ago, and they have stuff that works, right?
That's
and if
right.
George shows up and says, "Hey, I need bare metal," it's a lot easier for large organizations to give me just a bunch of ESX stuff than it is to
and
to do that.
This comment might be a little naive because I don't have a lot of experience with bare metal, but in the cloud native world, you start to adopt this immutable infrastructure mindset, and with a virtualized environment, it's very easy just to terminate something and rehydrate. But I'd imagine that'd be a little bit harder in the bare metal world. But I could be wrong.
Yeah. So one of the things I worked on before, I worked on Ubuntu before Heptio, and there are tools that do that, like Maz and things like that. But in order to get that kind of that you kind of have to go all in on a tool set, right? Like you couldn't say, I'm going to use a little bit of Ansible here, a little bit of this here, a little bit of that there. That solution means like, you'd have a Maz server. It's going to be the Pixie and DNS server on that network, right? And it kind of needs to handle everything. And you can kind of get that bare metal experience. And I'm sure I think the RackN guys also have something similar like that. That kind of gives you the cloud-like experience on bare metal. I've also gone down that rabbit hole, like in my home lab, and then you start to find things that were solved a long time ago when you're used to using a cloud. Like all of a sudden I have to start caring about firmware on NICs and IPMI implementations and stuff that I thought was solved 10 years ago. But we can go down that rabbit hole all day long. But there are definitely tools out there that there are definitely people working on these problems. A quick shout out that on bare metal, I do prefer kubeadmin. It's really, so I'm the kind of person that has a rack in the back. And if you just have a computer with Ubuntu CentOS or Fedora or whatever, and it's a generally supported operating system, I can get a cluster up and running in 5 minutes, without Ansible even. So those tools are definitely in development, but those have some limitations. If you're looking for a full multi-master setup with kubeadmin, obviously there's still some work to be had there. But I can never let go of my bare metal. Like, people make fun of me. They're like, man, just use GKE. I don't know what's wrong with me. So any more questions? Let me just scan back real quick.
I think there's one here about Ansible for Kubernetes installation.
And our thoughts on this. So I've actually seen a few Ansible solutions that I've tried in the past, and I think is KubeSpray Ansible? KubeSpray is Ansible, right?
Yeah, and there are a great many. So it's like, with configuration management systems, a lot of people would just write their own because something somebody else wrote is a little too complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Or does something and doesn't do something else. We use Ansible internally, I can't speak much of Ansible. I just find that it's probably the least evil of all configuration management systems, and it's also the simplest one. I think there are some projects on GitHub that I've seen that essentially implement most features of Ansible, but do so in Go, which I thought was interesting.
The one thing, so we use Ansible for all cluster bootstrap. We are moving to a model where we're using Packer and Terraform. First of all, if you are wanting to learn Kubernetes in depth, what I did, and it works great, is build a Kubernetes cluster from scratch with Ansible. And don't use kubeadmin, just build it from scratch. And you'll learn a lot about Kubernetes. KubeSpray, Kismatic, they offer great Ansible playbooks. But think about So if you have a production outage and you need to bootstrap a Kubernetes cluster like immediately, definitely take into consideration the time it'll take to build something from scratch with Ansible, or using Packer Terraform where you have everything baked into the image. Take
or
that
Linux
into
kit.
Or use Linux kit, yeah.
Yeah, this actually kind of leads on to a question, more of a comment. Are there any plans to focus more on bare metal deploys and the documentation? I spun up my first cluster on my own VMs recently, and I'm finding the process of learning made a lot harder because the docs definitely seem to focus more on cloud-based setups, resulting in me having to dig a lot through Slack, Google, and Git. So before we move on to this one, I wanted to add a corollary to Frank's thing. On learning, I did the manual thing once, and then I told myself, never again, unless it's like, a major version change, like a year from then or whatever. It's definitely a great learning experience, but I highly encourage not falling into the trap of setting up something manually and then that ends up accidentally in production. And
you don't want to be on the support hook for that.
Yeah, I was surprised how many people, when you're hanging out with Kelsey, like come up to him and say, hey, I kind of accidentally still have the thing that I read about the hard way running, and people depend on it, and it's like very frightening. But great learning resource, however. So I think I can take note of those questions here. There's a SIG for this called SIG on-prem, and Marco Ceppi is actually leading an effort this cycle to absolutely clear up and basically finish the bare metal installation. So there is a SIG whose entire purpose for existing is to make bare metal easier for everybody on Kubernetes. Unfortunately, it was led by someone who ended up leaving, and it's taken them a while to kind of get back on their feet. But I will provide you the link. They meet every other Thursday. Just link here. And that is run by Marco Ceppi and Dalton Hubble. And I'm tossing in SIG on premise. You can feel free to hop into one of their meetings. But yeah, I've helped write some of the bare metal documentation, and it definitely has a long way to go. And any help that any of you could provide, even if it's just helping them file bugs, letting them know what works and what doesn't work, would be a great help for them. Okay. Let's see. Next questions here. Martin recommends also checking out Tectonic for bare metal installs. Mr. Bobby Tables mentions he uses Cube Spray. And then he goes on to say, I say the largest hurdles when it comes to on-prem deployments is handling networking. And I can definitely plus one that experience. Let's see. Everyone's talking about themselves. Any more questions? Feel free to paste them in. We've got a lot of great links that at the end of the show, I'm going to collate them all together and stick them in a bunch of notes for everybody. Let's see. And I think next time we have bare metal, we should definitely have Mr. Bobby Tables on the meeting itself. I know he's doing a lot of work in this area, and it might be a good person to have on. People are talking about a bare metal load balancer called Metal LB, which I've not heard of. It's very interesting. More questions. We have about time for maybe one or two more questions. And while we're waiting for that, I got so sick at KubeCon. Frank, I don't know if you went, but stick 4,000 people in that. Someone's
I surprisingly did not get sick.
It's pretty busy, yeah.
Yeah.
Did you go to many talks, Frank?
So it's my first year presenting at KubeCon, and it was a fun experience. I tried to stay more towards the talks, focus on like SIG updates and whatnot. it's interesting to see how the conference has evolved as Kubernetes has started to become more, vendorized and commercialized and whatnot. And like the types of talks, I try to stay to the ones that are more like the SIG type of talks. And it was, I got a lot out of it. So.
Good. That is good to hear. And we're going to have time for one more question, but while we do that, I wanted to say, oh, here we go. One last one from Vlad. Any tips for a first-time person to go to KubeCon, not presenting? This is a good one. Like, I feel like next one I'm gonna try to do a lightning talk maybe the day before on how to get the most out of KubeCon. But any tips from you guys?
In Copenhagen. Well,
well, I mean, let's say you're going to your first KubeCon, right? Like, I feel like there are lightning talks the night before, which I wasn't aware of my first KubeCon.
Yeah, there are often meetups the night before too.
Looks like he froze up.
So I would definitely.
Oh.
Yeah, Frank. Yeah.
Sorry, you were frozen. Definitely look at the schedule. I know that it seems simple, but I've gone to conferences where I will look at the schedule. Do planning. Figure out beforehand, what the needs of maybe, your organization are, how you use KubeCon, or maybe how you want to mature personally with Kubernetes. And I guarantee you there's a talk focusing in on that specific item. So definitely plan ahead. And it's okay to veer off track once you get to the conference. Maybe you find a track that you really love and you're just in the same room all day, and that's okay. But definitely go in with a plan.
Also, the location in Copenhagen is the same location where DockerCon was, and I was there last autumn. And I wanted to add that it's close to the airport, but it's not very close to the city center. So choose your accommodation options wisely. And another thing, they definitely have pretty good selection of places to go out to, like bars and stuff. Like the craft beer in Copenhagen is really great, and also, I can suggest some. Oh, actually, at DockerCon we mostly ended up being stuck at this place called Warfix. That was the go-to bar for DockerCon. Maybe it's going to be a bit small for KubeCon, but we'll see. I'm sure, George, we're gonna end up there at some point.
Absolutely, yeah. Mr. Bobby Tables ad. So this was his first KubeCon, and I've gone to 2 so far. I think the biggest one is don't be afraid to talk to developers. I get to talk to users and developers, and it's interesting sometimes. Certain SIGs, they'll be like, "Oh, I just don't have enough user feedback on this one feature. Like, I wish I know." And then you go talk to a user, and they're like, "Oh, I wish I could talk to a developer and tell him that this feature is either great or needs this or whatever." So if you see a developer, go up and talk to them. Like, especially those of you that are talking about bare metal. Like, we have a SIG on-prem, we have a SIG cluster ops. Try to find them and especially when you go to these conferences, you'll see people who work at banks and very large organizations. And you're like, aha, they have to be running bare metal, right? They have to be running into my issues, that kind of thing. So it's not just also developers, but finding users that might be in the same boat as you. And Bob adds that the on-prem get-together at KubeCon US was really great. So that is pretty much it for time. So the way it works is we have these the third Wednesday of every month. This is the European time slot. We're going to have one in a few hours, 4 p.m. Eastern my time, to snag the West Coasters. We basically do this based on user demand. We kind of started the program in October, and now we're getting good at streaming and having a diverse group of guests and things like that. So if there's user demand for things like this, we can certainly do that kind of stuff. You can help us out by getting a friend. We have people that play these videos for their coworkers, maybe during a working lunch, that sort of thing. So please do let us know what adds value to you. We want to make this useful for you. And with that, I'd like to thank Northwestern Mutual. Did I get that right?
Yep.
Weaveworks, Pivotal, and Heptio for allowing us to do this on our work time and give back to the community. So thank you very much. Please feel free to stick around to hash office hours, make some new friends and things like that. And with that panel, would you like any further comments? We'll go in the same order that you introduce yourselves.
I just wanted to thank you, George. Thanks for setting up all the things and being on top of it as usual. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks also from my side. Sorry I could not contribute that much.
It's okay. It's all good.
Hopefully in future I can contribute a little bit.
Yeah, thank you guys for setting this up. I know in my early journeys with Kubernetes, I get stuck along the way at point here, point there, and something like this would have been very valuable. So I imagine that this is going to be very valuable for those that are getting started, and even maybe not getting started. Maybe they've been on the Kubernetes journey for a while and just need someone to ask a question. So I look forward to more of these.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add is every once in a while we'll get a senior developer who was there when they wrote the feature. So even if you've used Kubernetes for a while, it's really nice to get the insight on why something is designed that way, and why 10 years ago Borg did something, and that's why that is. And then they maybe changed it along the way or something like that. So you kind of get to see why things are and the history and things like that. So we try to do that. And for me, the reason I started this program is I started using Kubernetes to grab some old computers with kubeadmin. I couldn't get it to work, so I get to hide behind everybody's questions, even though I'm the one that's really looking for the answer. So, and with that concludes our session. We will see everybody a few hours. If you're able to make it to the next session. And if not, we'll see everybody next month. Thanks again, panelists, for giving up your time, and we'll see everyone next time.
Thanks, Ron.